Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining our webinar, How Identity Theft Affects Every Community. This webinar is part of a collaborative effort between the Federal Trade Commission and the Identity Theft Resource Center as part of Identity Theft Awareness Week. Our speakers today are the ITRC CEO, Eva Velasquez, and Charles Harwood, Director for the Northwest Region of the Federal Trade Commission. Before we get started, there are just a few housekeeping items that I'd like to mention. We will not have time to take live questions. However, if you have any questions as you listen today, or you discover that you need assistance with an identity crime issue, we encourage you to reach out to the ITRC or the FTC directly. Contact information for both organizations will be provided at the end of the presentation. And with that, I'll hand it right on over to Eva to get us started.
Thanks, Tim, and welcome everyone. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Identity Theft Resource Center, we're a 501c3 nonprofit established in 1999 to provide free recovery assistance for identity crime victims and free risk minimization education, much like this webinar today. Victims and consumers can engage with us through our toll-free hotline, live chat with us on our website, speak to a live advisor, yes, that's a real person, and they'll provide you with a tailored recovery plan or risk minimization plan based on your unique needs and circumstances, and all of that is at no cost to the public. Now, today we're looking at how identity crimes affect every generation and community. And to do that, I'll be using some of our recent demographic and impact data from our Consumer Impact Report. This report surveys individuals that contacted the ITRC for assistance with an identity crime case in the previous year. Alongside of that, we also surveyed the general population just to look at how their experience differed from the victims that contacted us. And once we look at that information, I'll provide some tips for minimizing your risk, and then we'll explore how you can leverage the free resources available at both the ITRC and the FTC. Now, let me start by saying it's really easy to think that something like this will never happen to me. Some of us are kind of operating under the premise that only certain people are vulnerable to identity crimes, scams, and fraud, and maybe that one segment of the population is really more at risk than any other, but that's just not true. Now, how you use and protect and recover your identity, that is definitely influenced by things like your age and your family upbringing, your culture, those types of things. But whether or not you become a victim, it really isn't. The reality is everyone is a potential target for identity thieves and scammers. And it's more about how you engage with the outside world, particularly the digital world, and if you practice good identity hygiene. Now, let's look at the spread out across the different age groups. And while the victims that contacted us for assistance skew a bit older, the general population group, it's really spread somewhat evenly, especially for those aged 25 to 54. But, let's face it, everyone has identity credentials, even children. And the identity thieves aren't picky. And identity credential, things like a social security number, a passport number, a driver's license number, all of those things are valuable to those thieves. And it's true that the bad actors will use different inducements to get victims to engage with them, especially when we're talking about scams. But consider that even within different age groups, there are going to be different vulnerabilities and different motivators in order to get a potential victim to engage with the scammer. Consider a senior that's in a care facility is definitely going to have different risk factors versus one that's living independently, has significant retirement income, maybe traveling. A 21-year-old college student is going to have different risk factors than a 21-year-old that's working full-time and trying to support themselves or even a family. But at the end of the day, they're all at risk because everyone is vulnerable. Now, let's take a quick look at race and ethnicity. As I said before, the way that people kind of manage and recover their identities can be influenced by these factors, by community and cultural experience. But as you can see by this chart, individuals of all backgrounds are experiencing identity crime victimization. Okay, education and income. Wow, I have heard so many pejorative statements about victims and consumers. Sometimes people say things like, oh, they're just not smart enough to avoid scams, or, oh, they're just too complacent or lazy to learn and use best practices. And I just disagree with that statement wholeheartedly. And as you can see by this chart, even folks with a college degree are vulnerable to these crimes, because the threat actors, they're hammering us daily. And under the right set of circumstances, once again, anyone can become a victim. This is true for scams, where someone is induced into parting with their money or their identity, but it's also true of identity crimes in general. I think many of us just don't realize that our data, things like our usernames and passwords, the devices that we use and how we safeguard them, all of these are factors that can either increase or decrease our risk. And with income, I really want to dispel the myth that if you're not a high net worth or high wage earner, that you aren't an attractive target. Nothing could be further from the truth. The thieves don't care about your true or actual financial picture. They care about those credentials. So many people will say to me, oh, I have a terrible credit score, so good luck to a thief applying for credit. Well, they can probably still apply for and get payday loans. And even though that it's a really high interest rate, something that the true owner of those credentials might not ever entertain, the thief doesn't care. They're not paying it back. Why would they care about the terms or the interest rate? It's irrelevant. It's just the cash in their hands. So let's look at some of these long-term life impacts for these victims. We asked in our survey what kind of financial related problems were created, what actually happens in someone's life. Only 36% of our respondents said they didn't experience any financial related problems. The overwhelming majority did. And those were specifically things like not being able to pay bills, not being able to get new lines of credit or find housing. And just think for a moment about the path that this can put you on, that inability to pay for, let's say, stable housing, for example. How is that going to impact your life moving forward? And an inability to get a car loan or pay for car repair, isn't that going to impact other facets of your life? It could potentially impact your ability to get to your job, so now your employment's affected. I really see it as this domino effect, and once that first domino tips, the rest just keep falling. There's also an emotional impact. Being a crime victim is a traumatic experience. And how does that trauma present? What are those negative emotions? You can see from this chart, the ITRC victims tended to present higher numbers in all categories. This makes sense because the more complex a case is, the longer one has to deal with it, and it can lead to experiencing a wider array of these emotions and in greater numbers. And we at the ITRC, we tend to get the more complex cases because of our referral partnerships with law enforcement agencies and other community-based organizations. But, within the general population, there were still high response rates for feeling anxious and violated and vulnerable. And the feelings of guilt or shame and embarrassment, they were notably higher among the victims that we assisted, but they certainly weren't non-existent for the general population. And I know we're all super busy and we have so much on our minds. It's easy to dismiss best practices and risk minimization as something that you just don't have time to put into practice. But I'm sharing these numbers with you so you understand that the effort that you put into educating yourself and practicing some of the tips that I'm going to give you, it's so worth it. It's so worth it to avoid these feelings and these experiences. So how can you reduce your risk of this happening to you? Now, Chuck is also going to provide some tips in his portion of the presentation, but here are mine. The first one, be skeptical. Please embrace your inner skeptic. There are so many different scams and identity crimes out there. A great way to reduce your risk is to just adopt this different mindset, this different attitude. This is especially true when we're talking about digital or online engagements. Remember, you can't give the same weight or level of trust to online transactions that you do to in-person or face-to-face transactions. So you have to adopt that skeptical mindset and verify, verify, verify. Using unique and complex passwords. Look, using the same easy password across multiple accounts is simply a gift to the threat actors. We really encourage people to make their passwords 12 characters or longer. Use a passphrase, not just a single word. Hackers have tools that can run through every word in the dictionary in seconds. And while we're at it, if you have the opportunity within a specific platform to choose a unique username and not just your email, that's usually the default, but sometimes you get a choice. Go ahead and do that too. It's just another layer of security. And I know that's a lot to remember. So if the only way you can follow this best practice is to write them down, then write them down. And very important caveat here though, do not digitize them. Do not put them in a Word or Excel document. Don't have them on sitting on your laptop or your desktop. You have to go analog here and write them on paper or in a notebook and keep them in a secure location. So it's true that there's a risk with having a physical copy of your passwords written down. But if you have them in a locked drawer in your home or in your office, your risk is that someone could physically break in and access them, which is far less risk than if you're using the same easy password across multiple accounts. Next tip, enable MFA, that's multi-factor authentication. And this is the option where once you log in with your username and password, you can have a special code, an OTP or one-time password sent to either your email or your phone, and you will have to enter that code in as well when you log in. It's just one more layer of security. You can hear the common theme here. The one caveat for this is never, never, never share this code with anyone. It says it right on the message when you receive it, not to share the code, but there's a lot of social engineering going on right now. And the scammers and the threat actors, they come up with some very legitimate sounding reasons. But I assure you, there is never a good reason to share that OTP code with anyone ever, period, the end. The next tip, go to the source. This applies just across the board, whether it's, an email, snail mail, a text message, a phone call, a direct message on social media. If you did not initiate the contact or the conversation, don't engage. Don't click on that link. Don't reply to that email. Don't reply to that text. Go to the source. The best example I can give is, let's say you get a text message and it appears to be from your bank saying, oh, we need to update your account or your password. Do not engage in that medium. Go and contact your bank in whatever way you would normally contact them. If you use online banking, go to the known URL and log into the website and go to the message center or customer service or live chat with them and say, hey, are you trying to get in touch with me? The chances are very, very, very high that they will tell you, no, we're not trying to get in touch with you. We don't ask you that. The next tip, take 5. Oh gosh, we're all being so deluged with all of this information, all of these offers. It's all incoming. And if you're feeling unsure or pressured in any way to engage or to provide information, again, to click on a link, I encourage you to just step away. Just take a moment to collect yourself and think. Now, this is also true, again, particularly for scams, because creating a sense of urgency is a tool that those bad actors will use because it engages our emotional brains. And our emotional brains are great at protecting us from risks like, the tiger in the jungle, and it engages our fight or flight response. But boy, it's not very good at making logical decisions. So when you disengage and step back, you really allow your logical brain to step in and help you to analyze the situation and make better decisions. And if that doesn't help, then that's where the next tip comes in. Phone a friend. Maybe you have someone in your personal network, a neighbor, a trusted colleague, a family member, just a good friend that you can bring the situation to and get their opinion. Does this sound real? Should I follow up on this? Have you ever heard of this before? And if that doesn't work, then you know what? The ITRC is your friend, and so is the FTC. You can phone us, you can reach out to us and ask questions. Tell us what the scenario is, and we will help to walk you through the process to verify if something is legitimate or if it's a scam. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Chuck.
Wow. Hello, Eva, and thank you for those great tips. So, and also, by the way, hello to everybody who's tuning in today. So this is Chuck Harwood. I'm an attorney with the Federal Trade Commission. In case you haven't heard of us, the FTC is the nation's consumer protection agency. We enforce consumer protection and antitrust laws. We educate consumers and businesses about those same laws. And we amplify our enforcement and education efforts through partnerships and coalitions, just like this one with the ITRC. So the Federal Trade Commission has lots of resources that I'm going to tell you about later to empower all of us to spot, avoid, and report identity theft. And one of those great tools is identitytheft.gov, which we'll hear more about later. But first, let's look at what reports tell us about identity theft in the United States. So the Department of Justice released its most recent survey findings on identity theft in April 2021. According to the U.S. Department of Justice, 23 million people in the U.S. experienced identity theft in 2018. And really, that's about 1 out of every 9 people age 16 and up. So Eve, let's go to the next slide. So how do so many people become victims of identity theft? How does it happen? There are a number of ways. Let's talk about a few of them. Because what happens is when identity theft steals your personal information without your permission, they'll use it to apply for loans or obtain credit in your name or do other things that are going to hurt you financially or hurt your reputation in terms of credit and other things. So first, a few of the old school or offline techniques identity thieves use. Sometimes the thief may know maybe someone we know. For example, it may be a caregiver or a contractor, and they may find information just laying around our house. Sometimes, many of us carry a treasure trove of information in our wallets and smartphones. And thieves, if they can get that information, will use it against us. Many of us have sensitive financial documents like bills and tax documents that show up in our mailboxes and can get lifted before we have a chance to get to them. Of course, there are lots of other ways that information is stolen offline as well. But these days, identity thieves also, in fact, more frequently, use technology to try to get your information. And so let's talk about a few of the online tactics they use. For example, you've probably gotten emails that seem legitimate. They appear to be from your bank or credit card company or utility, but guess what? They are not. How do you know? How can you tell? Because these emails ask for things like account or password information. Your bank, your credit card company is never, or utility is never going to ask for that kind of information. That's phishing. The same kind of request, a phishing request, could also come to you these days via text message. We call that smishing, and another thing to be worried about. Now, lots of people have lost their information in data breaches. For example, a number of years ago, the Equifax data breach exposed Social Security numbers and other personal information from 148 million people. And then finally, thieves have unfortunately figured out ways to get around even the most secure techniques we may use to try to protect our identities. For example, they may engage in something that we call skimming, which is where they read the magnetic strips on the back of credit cards using a special device. And these days, they've even developed a way to read some of those new chips on credit cards that we call shimming. And then finally, there are plenty of imposter schemes that we'll talk about in a few minutes. But let's first go to the next slide. So there's good news, and that is that we all have tools we can use. And we're going to talk about some of those tools today. These tools help us to protect against identity theft, the risk minimization Eva talked about, and they also help us recover when we are a victim. Let's go to the next slide then, Eva, so we can talk about the tools. So the first tool or tactic to be aware of is simply protecting the information around your house and the information you carry. That means things like don't carry your Social Security card in your wallet. Keep it somewhere very safe at home. Shred anything that has things like account numbers or a Social Security number on it before you throw it away. Make sure you check your email or check your mail frequently, regularly, and keep an eye on what comes in and what might be missing. Keep your personal information in a safe place at home, especially if you have roommates or overnight guests or outside help. You might even want to consider a lockbox to keep sensitive documents, things like checkbooks. And then finally, as I said earlier, keep an eye on all your accounts and financial statements. A great way to discover identity theft is spotting things that change. If a bill suddenly doesn't show up or something new shows up that seems out of the ordinary, you want to inquire about those things. Let's go on to another few other techniques, Eva. Sorry about that. My computer is being bulky, but here we go. All right. So the other area to think about is protecting your online accounts, because as I said, lots of identity thieves now engage in identity theft online. So Eva's already talked about some of these things, but for starters, use strong passwords and multi-factor authentication. We've already discussed that, but those are two great techniques. For example, with multi-factor authentication, that's an option where, particularly with your financial accounts, you can sign up for it, and that means the company will use something besides just your password when you log into an account. That way, if a hacker gets your password, they still won't be able to hack your account because there'll be this other piece of information that you may be providing, whether it's through some kind of a software device or through some other kind of hardware that will keep them from getting access. A few other thoughts: keep your operating system and security software updated, because that's a great way to avoid malware and other techniques that might try to break into your computer. But let's go on to the next slide, Eva. So I've mentioned a few minutes ago, and I want to take a special minute here to talk about what we call imposters. And particularly, I want to talk about government imposters. So no agency, federal or state, will call, email, text, or DM you to ask you for a social security number or your bank account number or your credit card number. These kind of out of the blue messages are huge red flags. No agency will ask you to pay by cryptocurrency, a gift card, or money transfer, or insist that you have to pay in cash. No agency will threaten you unless you pay. If anyone does any of these things, big red flag should go up, and you have to understand that contact, that person, is a scammer. That is an imposter. We see a lot of them in lots of different sectors and lots of different areas, but particularly we see a lot of them in connection with government agencies and their efforts. They claim to be from the government and claim to be trying to get you to do something that you really don't need to do, like give them your personal information. So let's go on to the next slide, then, Eva. So let's go back to talking about some tools that we have available to us to help protect ourselves from identity theft. Another great tool, and one of the most important steps you can take, is to simply monitor the credit reports about you from all three major credit reporting agencies. Now, by law, each of these three nationwide credit agencies or credit bureaus, Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion, have to give you a free copy of your credit report. Right now, they have to give you quite a few copies of them, but you can find out more about it by going to annualcreditreport.com. Since the pandemic started, more of these reports have been available, and you can find out how many and how to get them by going to, again, to annualcreditreport.com. Now, each credit bureau, each of the three I mentioned, has a slightly different, formats its information slightly differently. And they might have slightly different information. So it's worth checking all three reports, not just stopping at one. When you get your credit report, what should you look out for? What should you watch for? Well, look for incorrect names, addresses, and social security numbers. It's just maybe somebody else's information has somehow been confused with yours or been used in connection with your information. Watch for accounts you don't recognize. Look for balances or amounts owed that you don't recognize on your current accounts. Look for lots of credit inquiries from companies you didn't contact. That may mean somebody's trying to shop for information. If you think you've spotted something that looks suspicious, consider whether it might be identity theft. If you think it might be, there are two things you can do. If it might just be a mistake, think about going to another FTC website, ftc.gov/credit, to learn more about how to deal with mistakes on credit reports. But if you suspect identity theft, take action immediately by going to identitytheft.gov, which I will talk about in just a couple more slides. So Eve, let's go to the next slide though first. So one final tool I want to talk about before we talk about what to do if you are a victim. And this is another preventive tool. It's also a response tool. These are basically two different techniques. One is called a fraud alert and one is called a credit freeze. Now, these are proactive ways to protect against identity theft as well as ways to respond to identity theft. They sound alike, but they work in different ways. A fraud alert tells businesses to check with you before opening a new account in your name. Usually that means the business is considering opening an account in your name, they've received an application. Before they can do it, they have to call you to make sure you're the person trying to open a new account. Now, if they conclude it's you, they can go ahead and open the account. So it doesn't prevent them from opening it, but it means they have to check with you before opening one. You can place a fraud alert by contacting any one of the 3 national credit reporting agencies we've just spoken about. And typically what happens is people place these, and in fact, the law says they have to, they can place them after identity theft is suspected to have occurred. Now, a credit freeze is something different, and it's the best way to protect against an identity thief opening new accounts in your name. A credit freeze means potential creditors cannot access your credit report. And because creditors usually won't give credit, they can't check your credit report, that means the credit freeze blocks identity thieves who might be trying to open accounts. Now, you can place a credit freeze even if you haven't experienced identity theft, and you can do that simply by contacting each of the 3 credit reporting agencies separately. The credit freezes are free and can be placed, and they can also be lifted for free. You'll find out how to do that when you place your freeze. So if you place a freeze and later decide to apply for a job or rent an apartment or buy insurance, you may need to lift the freeze again. And you can do that by contacting the credit reporting agencies where you place the freeze. Again, more information about this is on the FTC's website. And also, by the way, there's a lot of information on a website I'm going to talk about in a minute called the IDTAW website. So your personal information, by the way, your personal situation will determine which of these makes the most sense for you. But be aware that you have these tools available, and they're certainly worth thinking about if you're concerned about either being targeted by identity thieves, or if you believe you might have been a victim of identity theft already. But now let's go to the next slide, Eva. So what do you do if you think you've been a victim? Here are 4 things to consider to do right away. First, call the companies where you know the fraud occurred, or you think the fraud might have occurred. If you think somebody might have opened an account in your name, or you think somebody might have purchased something in your name, contact that company and let them know you believe there's been fraud. Or they might have opened a credit card in your name, contact that company. Secondly, this is when you place one of those fraud alerts I just talked about on your credit reports. And by the way, get those credit reports too. The fraud alerts will let people know that they shouldn't accept additional applications for credit in your name without checking with you. And you, by the way, you can check your credit reports to see where the problems have been occurring. Third, report identity theft to the FTC. I'll talk about how to do that in just a second now. And finally, in many instances, you may want to file a report with your local police department. That's completely up to you. You can usually just call them. It's not a 911 call. Just call them on their regular phone line and ask them how to report identity theft to them, and maybe get a copy of that police report. Let's go to the next slide, Eva. So I've been talking about this website, and now I'm going to tell you a bit more about it. It's identitytheft.gov. And it is the FTC's website to help you recover if you believe you've been the victim of identity theft. It's an interactive site based on the idea that recovering from identity theft is easier if you have a plan. In a nutshell, what identity theft does is give you a plan with step-by-step guidance to recover from identity theft. It's easy to report. You simply click on Get Started, the Get Started button. You can see it on the screen right now. It will give you details on how you then input information about how your identity was stolen or misused, and the sites where it might have been used, and it will actually then generate customized specific guidance and suggestions for how to go about addressing the identity theft that specifically applies to you. And obviously, it's available in both English and Spanish. A great resource, lots of useful information. Almost everything I've talked about today can be found on identitytheft.gov. Let's go to the next slide, Eva. So as I've said, identitytheft.gov is a one-stop resource. It will give you, and among other things, it also gives you a streamlined report and recovery process. It'll actually allow you to produce a report that you can actually show to others, explaining what you've reported and what you believe has happened to you. It also gives you guidance about what to do. It also, by the way, creates sample letters. Remember, we talked about contacting the places where you believe identity theft has occurred. It'll help you create sample letters to contact places where you believe identity theft has occurred. And the reports you create, you can share those with other law enforcement agencies. Let's go to the next slide then, Eva, which I think might be the last one in this presentation. It is. So in short, we've covered a lot of different things today. We've talked about some of the ways identity theft affects every community. We've talked about some of the things you can do to reduce your risk to identity theft, risk minimization. We've talked about some of the tools available to both limit your risk, and also tools you can use to recover, such as identitytheft.gov. So you can learn more about some of the things we talked about through a variety of sources. As Eva said, contact the ITRC. They'd love to hear from you. They're there to help you and to help you figure out whether and what's happening if you believe identity theft has occurred and it affects you. Also check with the FTC. We want to hear from you. We have a lot of different resources online, as I've already described, including ftc.gov/identity theft. And by the way, you can report any identity theft or any kind of fraud, business fraud or bad practice at reportfraud.ftc.gov. You can order free FTC publications at bulk order. So if you want to hand out materials to others, you can order them from us at bulk order. And then finally, don't forget about that site I talked about, identitytheft.gov, which is a great FTC website. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to my friends at the ITRC.
Thank you so much, Chuck. Thank you so much. That was a fantastic presentation. I just want to take this moment to say thank you so much to everyone for joining us today. Please be sure to join us for more Identity Theft Awareness Week events, including new episodes of the ITRC's podcast, The Fraudian Slip, every day this week, focusing on identity crimes that are impacting college students.